In 1967, Israeli airpower helped define what modern air superiority looked like. Israeli aircraft struck quickly, gained control of the sky, and gave ground forces an enormous advantage. 6 years later, the sky looked very different. On October 6, 1973, Egypt and Syria launched a coordinated surprise offensive against Israel. Israeli fighters were still capable. Israeli pilots had not suddenly forgotten how to fight, and enemy aircraft were still part of the threat. But something else had become much harder to ignore. The danger was now coming from the ground. Dense networks of radar-guided surface-to-air missiles, anti-aircraft defenses, command posts, and supporting sensors created an environment in which controlling enemy fighters was no longer enough to guarantee freedom of action. That was the real shock of the Yom Kippur War. The fighter had not become obsolete, but the meaning of air superiority was beginning to change, and the lesson would reach far beyond Israel. If you enjoy stories about the battles, technology, and strategic decisions that change the way militaries fight, subscribe to Defense TV. Now, let's look at why the air war of 1973 forced air forces to rethink what air superiority really meant. To understand why 1973 mattered, it helps to remember what had happened only 6 years earlier. During the Six-Day War in 1967, Israeli air power achieved extraordinary results. The Israeli Air Force gained a level of freedom that allowed aircraft to support operations across multiple fronts. That experience helped reinforce a familiar idea: destroy or neutralize the enemy air force, and the sky becomes yours. But that idea was already becoming incomplete. Surface-to-air missiles were not new in 1973. The United States had encountered radar-guided missile defenses in Vietnam. Israel had also faced increasingly sophisticated ground-based air defenses during the years between 1967 and 1973. The warning signs were already there. What changed was the scale and organization of the problem. Egypt and Syria were not relying on one missile system sitting alone in the desert. They were building layers. Radar-detected aircraft. Different defensive systems covered different portions of the airspace. Command structures connected parts of the network. Ground forces could operate beneath that defensive protection. The individual missile mattered, but the network around it mattered more. That distinction is one of the most important lessons of the entire war. A fighter can avoid one threat. A pilot can react to one warning. But an integrated defensive environment creates a much more difficult problem. The aircraft may be dealing with enemy fighters, radar detection, missile threats, anti-aircraft defenses, geography, weather, fuel, mission requirements, and the urgent need to support troops on the ground, all at the same time. That is why the opening days of the Yom Kippur War became such an important case study. Israel was fighting a rapidly developing ground war. Air power was needed. But the same aircraft that had enjoyed remarkable freedom in 1967 now had to operate in areas protected by much denser ground-based defenses. Israeli aircraft suffered significant losses, particularly during the early phase of the conflict, and ground-based air defenses accounted for a major share of those losses. That produced an uncomfortable question. Had the missile broken the fighter? For a moment, some observers wondered whether modern air defenses had shifted the balance so far toward the defender that tactical aircraft might be losing their value. It was an understandable reaction, but it was also too simple. The lesson of 1973 was not that missiles had permanently defeated aircraft. It was that aircraft could no longer treat the defenses below them as a secondary problem. Air superiority was becoming a system problem, and that meant the solution would also have to become a system. This is where the story becomes larger than the Yom Kippur War itself, because militaries do not stop adapting when a new technology appears. The defender improves. The attacker responds. The defender changes again. That cycle is one of the oldest patterns in warfare, and 1973 became another dramatic example. As the war continued, Israel adapted. The ground battle changed. The conditions under which aircraft operated also changed. The extremely difficult opening period did not remain frozen for the entire conflict. That matters because it prevents us from drawing the wrong conclusion. The missile was powerful. The network was dangerous. But neither created a permanent solution to the problem of air attack. Instead, they created a new challenge that air forces would have to learn how to manage. The United States was paying attention, but the American story did not begin in the Middle East. It began earlier. During the Vietnam War, the United States had already experienced the growing difficulty of operating aircraft against radar-guided defenses. American aircrews had learned that controlling enemy aircraft was only one part of surviving over defended territory. Radar warning, surface-to-air missiles, anti-aircraft defenses, electronic interference, intelligence, coordination, and specialized support all mattered. So when American military analysts examined the Yom Kippur War, they were not discovering this problem for the first time. What they were seeing was confirmation. A second major conflict had demonstrated that modern ground-based air defenses were not a temporary feature of one battlefield. They were becoming a permanent part of modern air warfare. That distinction is critical. Vietnam provided direct American combat experience. The 1973 war provided another large-scale battlefield example. Together with other Cold War experiences, those lessons reinforced the idea that future air forces would need more than better fighters. They would need better systems. That meant electronic warfare. It meant better intelligence. It meant more realistic training. It meant better coordination between different aircraft and supporting forces. It meant finding ways to reduce the ability of enemy defenses to interfere with air operations. It meant improving precision so aircraft could accomplish more without repeating unnecessary exposure. And eventually, it also meant asking a more radical question. Could an aircraft itself be designed to become harder for radar to detect? That question would contribute to one of the most important technological shifts in military aviation: stealth. But stealth was not the direct product of one war. The F-117 was not created simply because of what happened in October 1973. The development of low-observable aircraft came from years of research, engineering advances, computational progress, experience from Vietnam, changing strategic requirements, and the continued growth of radar-guided defenses. The Yom Kippur War belongs inside that larger story. It reinforced the problem. It did not create every solution. And perhaps the best way to see that process of adaptation is to jump forward 9 years. In 1982, another major confrontation involving aircraft and ground-based air defenses unfolded over Lebanon's Bekaa Valley. This time, the result looked dramatically different. Israel had spent years studying the problems revealed during previous conflicts. Its air force had changed. Its training had changed. Its coordination had improved. Its use of intelligence, electronic support, and specialized capabilities had matured. The point is not to turn Bekaa Valley into a technical manual. The important point is the contrast. In 1973, dense ground-based defenses had created a major shock. By 1982, the attacking air force approached the problem as part of a much broader system. That difference tells us something fundamental about military technology. A weapon that looks dominant in one conflict can appear much less dominant after the opponent adapts. Not because the weapon stopped working, but because the system around the battlefield changed. The surface-to-air missile had not become useless. The fighter had not become invulnerable. The contest had simply moved to another level. And that pattern continued. By the time of the Gulf War in 1991, Western air power had become far more integrated than it had been 2 decades earlier. Aircraft were no longer thought of only as individual platforms flying individual missions. Air campaigns increasingly depended on layers of support: intelligence, electronic warfare, airborne command and control, aerial refueling, precision weapons, specialized aircraft, mission planning, and coordinated efforts to reduce the effectiveness of hostile air defenses. Again, it would be wrong to draw a straight line from 1973 to Desert Storm and claim one war created everything that followed. Military change rarely works that way. Vietnam mattered. The Yom Kippur War mattered. Bekaa Valley mattered. Training programs mattered. Technology mattered. Cold War competition mattered. Engineering mattered. And each conflict provided another piece of evidence about what modern air warfare was becoming. The United States and the Soviet Union also viewed these wars through a wider Cold War lens. Many of the air defense systems used by Egypt and Syria were Soviet-designed. Israel operated aircraft and equipment with important American connections. That made the Middle East more than a regional battlefield. It became another place where the world's major military powers could observe how technologies, doctrine, and training performed under real pressure. But describing 1973 as simply American weapons against Soviet weapons would miss the point. Hardware alone does not explain what happened. Doctrine matters. Training matters. Command structures matter. Geography matters. Timing matters. And the ability to connect many different capabilities into one functioning system can matter more than the specifications of any single weapon. This is the same reason comparing two fighters only by speed, radar range, or missile count can be misleading. Modern air power is not just an aircraft. It is the network around the aircraft. A fighter may be the most visible part, but it depends on information, fuel, maintenance, surveillance, command and control, electronic support, other aircraft, ground forces, and increasingly, data from many different sensors. The same is true on the defensive side. A missile launcher sitting by itself is dangerous. A missile launcher connected to sensors, command systems, other defensive weapons, and a broader military network is something else entirely. That is the deeper lesson 1973 helped reveal. The contest was no longer fighter against fighter, or fighter against missile. It was system against system. And once you look at air warfare that way, many later developments make more sense. Why invest so heavily in electronic warfare? Because the information flowing through the defensive system matters. Why develop specialized aircraft and capabilities for dealing with air defenses? Because enemy fighters are not the only threat to air operations. Why train pilots in more realistic, complex environments? Because the first time they encounter a sophisticated defensive network cannot be during an actual war. Why pursue precision? Because completing a mission efficiently can reduce the need to expose aircraft repeatedly. Why develop stealth? Because making detection and tracking more difficult can change how much time a defensive network has to react. None of these answers replaced the fighter. They changed what the fighter needed around it. And that may be the most important correction to the dramatic claims that appeared after 1973. The missile did not end the age of the combat aircraft. The fighter did not defeat the missile forever in 1982. Neither side achieved a permanent technological victory. Instead, offense and defense continued adapting to one another. Radar improved. Aircraft changed. Missiles improved. Electronic systems changed. Sensors became more capable. Aircraft signatures were reduced. Networks became more connected. And the competition continued. That same logic remains central to military aviation today. Modern fighters may be faster, more connected, more precise, and harder to detect than the aircraft that flew in 1973. Modern air defenses are also far more sophisticated than the systems of that era. So the central problem has not disappeared. It has become more complex. How does an air force create freedom of action when the opponent is trying to detect, track, disrupt, and restrict it? That question cannot be answered by one aircraft. It cannot be answered by one missile. And it cannot be answered by one missile. Spectacular piece of technology. It requires a system. That is why the Yom Kippur War remains so important more than half a century later. Not because it proved that one side had discovered the future of warfare, not because it made fighters obsolete, and not because every modern air power concept can be traced directly back to October 1973. It matters because it exposed a change that could no longer be ignored. A powerful air force could still find its freedom sharply constrained if it faced a well-organized ground-based defensive network. Winning against enemy aircraft was no longer enough. The Air Force itself had to become part of a larger, more coordinated system. That realization helped shape decades of adaptation, from the lessons of Vietnam to the shock of 1973, to the contrasting experience of Bekaa Valley, to the increasingly integrated air campaigns that followed. The technology changed, the aircraft changed, the defenses changed, but the underlying competition remained. The missile did not replace the fighter. It changed what the fighter needed around it, and air superiority stopped being something a fighter could create by itself. It became something an entire system had to produce. So what changed air power more? The rise of the surface-to-air missile, or the military systems that evolved in response to it? Tell me what you think in the comments. And if you want more stories about the wars and technologies that forced militaries to change, subscribe to Defense TV for the next documentary.